If you're any kind of fan of my show at all, you know the ocean is a scary place. Even in modern times, death is a common occurrence, and disappearances still happen to this day. Even with modern methods of tracking ships, like EPIRBs and AIS, accidents still happen and people are still lost. These days, much of the ocean remains a mystery, with at least 80% of our ocean unexplored. Of course, where gaps in knowledge occur, folks tend to fill it with fantasy. So, to ancient and pre-modern sailors who knew even less, sea monsters were a common tale to explain horrible deaths. If you know anything about sailing, you've likely heard of the sirens. These creatures stretch all the way back to the Greek epic The Odyssey, a story written in the 8th century BC by the poet Homer. In it, the brave Odysseus is warned of a strange creature called a siren, who lives in the cliffs of the island Sirenum Scopuli. It's said that their voice is so beautiful that it'll draw in any sailor to their doom, crashing their ships upon the rocks before being feasted upon. Odysseus, rather smartly, has his crew fill their ears with beeswax to drown out the song. But, curious to hear it, he himself is tied to the mast so as not to harm himself. Upon sailing close, he hears the gorgeous music and begs to be released to go for it, but the crew tie him down tighter. They successfully sail past, and the sirens, in great despair, throw themselves into the sea instead. Sirens have been in sailing culture since it started. Homer didn't describe the beasts at all, but later depictions showed them as bird-like in nature, some saying they had the body of a bird and head like a woman, or that they were all woman from waist up, but bird-like from waist down. A 10th century Byzantine dictionary explained them as sparrows from chest up with a woman's lower body, and some were described as little birds with women's faces, which I find to be a hilarious image. But pretty much all of them were women mixed with either birds or, around the 3rd century BC, fish. Especially in the early medieval to Renaissance period, sirens became more and more synonymous with mermaids. Mermaids may very well be the most prolific and well-known mythological sea creature in the world. Mentions of them can be found as far back as the 7th to 8th century AD. Again, they are mentioned as sirens, but instead of being bird-like, they are described as women with beautiful feminine torsos and heads and the tail of a fish. And so many stories carried the same malevolent behaviors of sirens, luring sailors to their dooms. But a fair few had them as simply curious. The pendulum seems to swing wildly back and forth from story to story. Some are depicted as rewarding good deeds with gifts of treasures. Some simply want to lure a nice man to the sea and an early watery grave. The truly astonishing thing about mermaids are just how many cultures have a mermaid story or folklore. Darn near every seagoing culture has a mermaid. Old English, they were mermen. In ancient Syria, they had a mermaid goddess named Derceto that had a baby from an affair. She was so ashamed she left it in the desert and drowned herself before becoming a human-headed fish. In Eastern Europe, they had rusalkas that lured sailors to their doom. They tended to be the unclean dead of women who died, typically by drowning before their wedding, and the Chinese had tales of an entire nation of merfolk called the Dai people, dating back to the 4th century BC. The nation had both human-headed fish called chiru, and more human-like people called renyu, and that's just naming a few. There are even historical accounts from credible sources speaking of individuals encountering mermaids. We of course know the story of Christopher Columbus encountering them in the Caribbean Sea, but there are even stories stretching into the modern era, the most recent being from 2012, when some workers in Zimbabwe refused to go to their job site by the sea due to recent reports of mermaids. This, like many older tales, clearly depicts that seeing mermaids was often a very bad omen. Of course, these days we know that most mermaid sightings were simply accredited to manatees or dolphins, but it's still very interesting to see just how prolific of a tale they were. Another well-known mythological sea monster, or perhaps more a hazard to navigation, were the Greek sea monsters Scylla and Charybdis. Scylla and Charybdis were twin hazards situated on either side of the Strait of Messina between Sicily and mainland Italy. Scylla sat upon the mainland on a rock outcropping and was a terrifying 6-headed, 12-legged monster that gobbled down any sailors that steered too near. She was created when a man fell in love with her when she was a beautiful maiden. He went to a witch to produce a love potion, but the witch loved the man. So she poisoned a pool that Scylla frequented, causing her to become a hideous monster. But Charybdis, on the other hand, was a massive living whirlpool that sat near to Sicily. She was apparently a daughter of Poseidon. She helped her father by swallowing whole huge portions of land with sea. This angered Zeus, and he cast her down to the seafloor with a lightning bolt, as you do. 3 times a day, she would swallow a huge amount of seawater before expelling it out. According to legend, the strait was only an arrow shot's width, so if a ship were to avoid one hazard, they'd only land in the jaws of another. You could avoid Charybdis and have your sailors snatched off your boat by the gnashing jaws of Scylla, or avoid Scylla and risk your entire ship being swallowed up by the living whirlpool. When Odysseus faced that perilous strait, he was told to avoid Charybdis and steer towards Scylla. Better to lose a few men than his entire ship. He did so, and 6 of his men were snatched up and swallowed whole, but the ship made it through. An idiom sprouted from this tale to be stuck between Scylla and Charybdis, meaning a bad situation where neither solution is favorable. The Greeks seem to encounter a lot of sea monsters, probably due to how important the Mediterranean was to them and how prevalent sailing was in their culture. But you know who encountered sea monsters a surprising amount? The Germans. In World War I, specifically. This isn't even a joke. There are exactly 2 accounts of 2 different German submarines encountering sea monsters during the Great War. And I know you're saying, Ian, 2 isn't a lot. And I'll give you that. But you gotta admit it's weird that it happened twice. During the Great War, the German wolf pack was plying the seas, making trade for the Allies a total nightmare. In 1914, 15 Allied ships were sunk by U-boats. But in 1915, that number rose to 757, and would nearly double each year after that. But apparently, the German U-boats weren't the only thing hunting in the North Atlantic. On the 30th of July, 1915, the cargo steamer Iberian was sailing from Manchester, England to Boston, Massachusetts. While off the coast of southern Ireland, she was attacked by a U-boat, U-28, who fired 2 torpedoes, striking Iberian in the stern. The ship attempted to flee as U-28 pursued, firing at the steamer with her deck gun. A shell burst over the bow, killing 6 men and wounding 8. Finally, Iberian, pouring out smoke and limping badly, stopped and the captain ordered abandoning ship. The British cargo ship sank stern first, her bow pointing high into the air as she slipped under. On the conning tower of SM U-28, Commander Georg Gunther von Forstner watched his target yield to the deep blue. He and 6 others stood and watched, but about 25 seconds after the ship sank, a massive secondary explosion rocked the ship. The men turned and watched, stunned, believing the ship's boilers exploded after coming in contact with the cold Atlantic waters. They were flabbergasted as a gout of seawater and debris flew 80 feet into the air, and in amongst it was a living sea creature. A massive 60-foot-long, scaled creature looking like a finned crocodile with a tapered snout was blown out of the water. It fell back to the sea with a mighty splash, thrashing about. It thrashed there for about 10 to 15 seconds before slipping back beneath the waves. Commander von Forstner said he didn't have time to have a camera grabbed to snap a shot, but he wasn't alone in seeing it. 6 others, standing and watching, could attest to it. On top of that, 61 sailors survived from SS Iberian. Of course, they'd all attest to that. That sounds incredible, right? Almost too amazing to believe. Well, it is almost too amazing to believe. Dr. Darren Naish, a zoologist and natural historian, wrote a good article on the incident. It's interesting to note that von Forstner actually wrote a memoir several years later that made no note of seeing the sea monster. A weird thing to leave out of your memoir, seeing how intriguing it was. In fact, the war diary from the U-28 doesn't mention it at all, stating that the Iberian was attacked, it sank, there were 70 to 80 survivors, and the U-28 provided medical aid to 2 before they were sent away. Truth is, von Forstner didn't even write about this sea monster until 1933, which, as Dr. Naish points out, was the year George Spicer and his wife had their famous Loch Ness Monster sighting. Good time to remember such a thing, huh? But the 6 men on the conning tower. All conveniently dead by this time, save one that never made a statement on it. And the 61 men on the Iberian that were rescued, all very tight-lipped about seeing an actual sea monster. They were even interviewed about the incident by papers and never once mentioned anything about it. Well, perhaps that one was a bust, but it wasn't the only instance. In late April of 1918, the hunter became the hunted. U-boat SMUB-85 was hunting the waters of Northern Ireland near Belfast. Captain Lieutenant Gunther Kretsch hadn't sunk a ship in a while, and he was hungry. He hunted the shipping channels looking for Allied steel to send to the bottom. Standing on the conning tower late at night looking for his next victim. He never expected to become the next victim himself. He felt a great heaving to starboard as the ship listed heavily as something climbed aboard. Kretsch was horrified as he watched a monster climb onto the forward deck. With a horned head full of dagger-like teeth that glistened in the moonlight, big eyes leered at him before latching onto the deck gun and wrenching on it back and forth. The creature's talons damaged the deck, and the captain and his men fired on the beast with their sidearms. It did massive damage to the deck before it was run off by the handguns, biting into its scaled hide like a swarm of bees. By this time, the boat was so heavily damaged it couldn't dive, and just in time for HMS Corepsus to come upon them. The British sailors, surprised to see the terrified Germans throw up their arms and surrender, all of them telling a wild tale of a monster attacking them. Pretty definitive stuff, right? Well, maybe not so cut and dry. In fact, the only one who told this tale was Captain Kretsch himself. The senior stoker on board, Julius Gottheimer, had a very different story. When the Germans spotted HMS Corepsus approaching, they ordered a crash dive. Upon doing so, the conning tower hatch wasn't properly secured, causing a downflooding of water into the tower, then the rest of the boat. Water flooded the engines, damaged batteries, and destroyed circuits. Chlorine gas released from the waterlogged batteries threatened to kill them all. They were forced to blow ballasts and emergency surface before surrendering to the Royal Navy. The problem with the hatches? The captain had wanted a new heater placed in the officers' quarters. A wire had to go through the hatch to get to it to run, meaning the hatch couldn't be sealed. So perhaps it was less a monster and more of a captain trying to cover his own rear. Many consider the two monsters made up by the Germans to be in the greater classification of sea serpents, perhaps one of the most famous examples of sea monsters. Sea serpents have been spoken of almost as long as man has sailed the seas, from ancient Mesopotamia's Tiamat to the Bible's own Leviathan. Sea serpents have always been in mythology and to a lesser extent cryptozoology. Descriptions of sea serpents can also be found pretty close to the modern era too. A Norwegian clergyman by the name of Reverend Hans Egede was amongst the early explorers of Greenland, and in 1734 gave a description of a sea serpent they had spotted, stating it arose out of the water to a height above the main top and had a long, sharp snout and broad flippers. It was covered in scales and wrinkled skin, and the lower part was like a snake. After a bit of time, it dived under and had a tail that was as long as the ship itself. After seeing it, they suffered bad weather. This goes along with a common theme that sightings of these creatures were a bad omen and foretold storms or disasters. In August of 1848, the Royal Navy fifth-rate frigate HMS Daedalus was underway near modern-day Namibia. The crew suddenly spotted a serpent swimming on the surface. They stated his head rose a solid 4 feet from the surface, with another 60 feet trailing behind and a good 30 feet of body still below the water. They said it swam by at an incredible speed of 10 to 13 knots. The captain, Captain McQuay, stated that it swam so close that had it been a man of my acquaintance, I should have easily recognized his features with the naked eye. Modern biologists state it was likely a sei whale that the Daedalus spotted. As it turns out, many sea monsters, upon later scrutiny, tended to just be whales. But in antiquity, whales really weren't understood very well. Most thought of them as massive sea monsters. In some rare instances, they kind of were. We hear about Jonah and the whale in the Bible, where God punished Jonah for fleeing by having him befall a storm. After he's thrown overboard, he's swallowed by a whale and vows to obey God. In Greek mythology, we hear of both Perseus and Heracles fighting and beating Cited, who is sometimes depicted as a huge whale and a symbol of Poseidon's wrath. But there are other examples of whales attacking mankind. In the 6th century, near the Byzantine capital of Constantinople, a massive whale was attacking Eastern Roman shipping. A horrible, angry whale that the people named Porphyrios would attack merchant ships, fishing ships, and warships alike, sinking them, often attacking near the Bosphorus Strait. Porphyrios is believed to mean a deep, dark purple, perhaps in reference to the color of the whale. It's believed Porphyrios was either an exceptionally large orca, about 45 feet in length, or a sperm whale calf that accidentally entered the Sea of Marmara at a young age and got stuck. It ended up living for around 50 years, attacking ships periodically before disappearing for long stints. But so terrifying and demoralizing were the attacks that Emperor Justinian I ordered the capture of the whale. He just, didn't know how to do that. But one day, Porphyrios was chasing a pod of dolphins near the Bosphorus when he ran himself onto the beach. Local villagers, recognizing the infamous whale, descended upon him with ropes and axes and started hacking at him. At first they had little effect, only angering the whale that struggled ineffectually, but with carts and horses they drugged the creature ashore and cut him to pieces. Some saved the meat to eat later, but there are reports that some consumed the flesh of the whale on the spot. There's actually no way of confirming that this was Porphyrios, but seeing as how rare whales are in the Sea of Marmara, they kind of assumed it was because the attacks sort of stopped happening after that. We all know the story of Moby Dick, the great white whale battling it out with the enraged and near rabid Captain Ahab. But did you know Herman Melville's story is loosely based upon a true story? In August of 1819, a whaling ship departed Nantucket bound for the Pacific. The Essex was a smaller whaling ship at about 88 feet long and had a crew of 21 men. With her 4 whaleboats, she'd make for the Pacific to catch sperm whales and harvest their oil. They expected it to be about a 2-year trip. What they didn't expect was in November of 1820, in the middle of the Pacific, a bull sperm whale charged their ship. It rammed into the side of the wooden ship until the side caved in. The men, loaded into the boats to hunt, returned to find their ship sinking, while they were about 1,000 miles from any point of land and about 2,000 miles from civilization. They all loaded into the whaleboats, salvaging all that they could to survive, before heading out for South America. The trip back took a grueling 3 months, and slowly the men ran out of food and resorted to cannibalism. Of the 21 men that left Nantucket, only 8 survived the harrowing ordeal. It still to this day isn't understood what could have driven the whale to attack the ship in such a way. It's not something that's often seen in sperm whales. Similar to how many sea monsters kind of just turned out to be whales, the kraken usually just ended up being a colossal squid. The kraken is an iconic sea monster, but actually doesn't stretch as far back as some others. It's surprising because just look at octopi and squids. They are such alien-looking creatures. It's surprising they aren't depicted as monsters more often. But the first vaguely kraken-esque monster comes from 1539, when Swedish writer Olaus Magnus drew a Swedish map called the Carta Marina. In the Norwegian Sea, he drew 2 sea monsters, one being a fish with tusks and the other a fish with tentacles. He described it as having horrendous flaming eyes, the circumference of which were 16 to 20 feet wide. Another description again comes from Hans Egede, the reverend that was exploring Greenland. He stated that Norwegian fishermen described the kraken as many miles in length, that it would surface and consume fish, men, and ships alike with numerous claws and heads. Also, if they were ever to hook it, the only way to get unstuck from it was to state its name. Perhaps the most famous depiction of the kraken was from Jules Verne's 1870 novel 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, when the submarine Nautilus was attacked by giant squids. But not all giant squid attacks were the work of fiction or fantasy. In 1978, the U.S. Navy Knox-class frigate USS Stein was underway in the Pacific, running a normal submarine picket. Her AN SQS-26 sonar was operating at the time when they started getting anomalous returns on it. After some time, the display was coming back completely useless, with far too much clutter. Seeing as this was a vital piece of equipment for the ship's anti-submarine warfare suite, as well as just normal navigation, they returned to port and the ship was put into dry dock. There they observed the sonar pod and were stunned at what they saw. The protective rubberized coating on it was racked with multiple slashing marks, some still featuring large curved claws still embedded in the rubber. They brought on a marine biologist to investigate the damage, only to discover that the claws were from the suction cups of a squid, just much larger than any species that had yet been found. The evidence from the attack aided in the documentation of a yet undiscovered massive deep-sea squid species. Today, we know sea monsters don't actually exist, but I find them to be a fun and interesting topic. Terrifying beasts from an age when the world was much bigger and a much scarier place. When one could look at the peripheries of an atlas and see depictions of horrible beasts and wonder what was truly out there. There are hundreds of myths and tales, and I only just scratched the surface in this video. If folks enjoyed this, I might even do a deeper dive into every one of these creatures. I even left out some of the more inland situated monsters and spirits like the Kelpie and the Silky and the Vodnik. So let me know if you want a deeper dive on them. So will sailing around Greenland get you swallowed up by the Kraken? Could that alluring melodic music you hear on deck be coming from a siren? Probably not, but better safe than sorry. Did I miss your favorite sea monster? Do you know any personal sea stories about sea monsters? Let me know in the comments, and stay tuned for more superstitions from the Superstitious Sailor. Fair winds and following seas, shipmates.